everyone's doing well. I am Linda Burton. I'm the Executive Director of the Cambridge Center for Adult Education. I want to welcome you to the third virtual discussion in our Conversations on the Edge series. For those of you who are not familiar with CCAE, we are a community-based nonprofit. We're located in Harvard Square, and we offer very affordable programming for adults to explore their interests in an experiential classroom environment. Before the pandemic hit, those experiences were in person, but since last spring, we successfully transitioned online, and we're now offering actually over 300 classes per term via Zoom. And we offer everything from art and cooking and languages, writing, literature. And we really encourage you to explore our offerings on our website at ccae.org. Tonight, we continue our Conversations on the Edge series with a discussion called Inside Cambridge Community Foundation's Innovative and Equity Cities Report, The Case of Cambridge. Before I introduce our distinguished moderator, I want to go over a couple housekeeping notes for you all so that will help to help us enjoy tonight's conversation. First off, we ask that you turn off your microphones and webcam during the conversation so as to minimize distractions. The staff may turn them off for you during the conversation, so if that happens, don't be alarmed. And then we invite you to turn them back on, turn your webcams back on at the end of the presentation during our Q&A portion. If you experience an unstable connection, we advise you to wait a minute or two, and then if it's still unstable, you may want to exit the meeting, come back in. We find that sometimes, helps resolve the issues. I think we're all sort of Zoom experts by this point, but just to let you know that. And then if time allows, as I mentioned before, we're going to have a Q&A at the end. And if you have any questions, we suggest that during the conversation, just click on the chat icon at the bottom of the screen and type in your questions there. And finally, please note that this event will be recorded. So you'll be able to view it later in the future on our website at ccae.org. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for tonight and the person who is responsible for the launch of the important report we'll hear about tonight, the president of Cambridge Community Foundation, Geeta Pradhan. Geeta draws on her deep experience in philanthropy, urban planning, and economic development to address the needs of Cambridge. She transformed a local grant-making organization into a local giving platform that supports our city's shared prosperity, social equity, and cultural richness. Geeta is a close collaborator of the Cambridge and Greater Boston nonprofit sector, having authored 2 reports on the financial health of the mass nonprofit sector, organized the creation of the Massachusetts Nonprofit Network, and facilitated the founding of the Institute of Nonprofit Practice. She serves on several public sector task force boards and committees, including the City of Cambridge's Youth and Family Policy Council, Community Benefits Advisory Committee, and the STEAM Task Force. She also serves on the boards of the Kendall Square Association, Central Square Business Improvement District, Institute for Nonprofit Practice National Advisory Board, and Family Independence Initiatives Local Advisory Board. Geeta previously worked for the Boston Foundation, served as the Associate Vice President of Programs, where she oversaw grant making and community impact, led the multi-neighborhood Fairmount Corridor effort, focused on equity and opportunity, and co-founded the Boston Indicators Project to drive scaled social change. Prior to that, she worked for the City of Boston, serving as Director of Sustainable Boston and Assistant Director for Neighborhood Development. A trained artist, she completed her Bachelor's of Architecture in India and holds a Master in Urban Design from the Harvard Graduate School of Design. Wow. So please join me in welcoming Geeta Pradhan.
Thank you, Linda. Remind me next time to send you a shorter bio. My apologies to everyone.
Very impressive.
But good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us today to discuss and explore findings of Equity and Innovation Cities, the Case of Cambridge, a report on the state of equity in a leading innovation city. As Cambridge's Community Foundation focused on, as Linda said, shared prosperity, social equity, and cultural richness, We look forward to an authentic, edgy, remember this is conversations on the edge, sometimes difficult and uncomfortable conversations that will bring us together around a shared agenda for the city that we all love. We launched work on this report 3 years back on pre-pandemic observations that Cambridge, a growing innovation hub, was seeing levels of gentrification that were pushing people out, making the city unaffordable for many, creating housing stress and growing racial and income disparities. And a lot of people were comparing us to San Francisco. And I remember an article that was, I think it was in the New York Times or the Atlantic, that said, is San Francisco losing its soul? And that is what we were concerned about. Were we about to lose our soul if we became a city that was so drastically different and we lost all the things that we loved because we weren't paying attention? Our greatest concerns were linked to gentrification. And we set out to look at Cambridge in comparison with initially San Francisco. And thanks to some phenomenal groundbreaking research that Jessica did, we compared us. We actually could not find another city that was similar to Cambridge. And so we ended up looking at 25 cities, some mature, some emerging, and some very new, that had characteristics that were similar to Cambridge. And one of the things that we found was that those who were hurting the most in gentrification through gentrification were also people who were going to probably be hurt the most during the pandemic or the post-pandemic era. Even though it's going to take us time to capture that data on how the pandemic has affected everyone, I would say that, early anecdotal information and some of the early data that the report includes, the Mayor's Disaster Relief Fund, the Cambridge Community Foundation's Emergency Fund for COVID relief, they enabled us to actually be directly in touch with many families and individuals who were reaching out for help. And one saw the immense instability that Cambridge has. So our hope is that should never happen again. Were something like this to come up again, we should be prepared for it. And with those issues of equity and justice in mind, this report looks at the effect of innovation on the city's success and its residents. It looks at data over a decade. And it basically tries to go broad and very deep. And Jessica will cover a lot of that. So just give you a brief idea of how we're going to run this this evening's conversation is that Jessica Martin will, she's the principal researcher on this report, will present a very high level of the report's findings. We want to encourage you to go to the website of this report and really play around with the data, look at the data. If you want a hard copy of the report, we should be able to have access to that too. And someone will actually put up the link to that in the chat. So someone on our team will put that up. So after Jessica's presentation, we will spend about 45 minutes with this very, very impressive panel, to talk about their reactions and their thoughts about equity and innovation, which will be then followed by audience questions. I also want to mention that this is one of our, we released the report on April 7th. This is the first conversation we are having, but we are hoping to have many such conversations in Cambridge because we need to have many such conversations. So with that, I'd like to introduce Jessica Martin, the principal researcher of the project. Jessica is a consultant to the nonprofit and philanthropic sector with over a decade of experience in data, research, and policy work. She has a deep personal commitment to democratizing data and make it open and accessible to all. And I've seen her do that even on this project, which was largely done pro bono. Jessica serves as a fellow to the Cambridge Community Foundation. As I mentioned, is not just the principal researcher, but also co-author of this report. Previously, she was senior policy advisor on open data at the Massachusetts Executive Office of Technology Services and Security. And prior to that, Jessica was at the Boston Foundation as director of the Boston Indicators Project. She's a graduate of the University of Massachusetts Amherst and the McCormick Graduate School of Public Policy at UMass Boston. Welcome, Jessica, and over to you.
Great, thanks, Geeta, and thanks everybody for being here. And I'm going to just actually share my screen and dive right into some information about the report just to ground the conversation. So Geeta gave a great overview of the genesis of this report, and I'm just going to share some of our findings, which really, number one is that Cambridge really is a leading innovation city nationally and globally. And this has been built over a really dynamic decade of growth marked by innovation and growth that goes beyond the sector itself. But as I'm sure many of you can see every day, Cambridge's resulting prosperity has not been shared equally. And the disparities across income and race that have always existed have been exacerbated by the pandemic. And so with this report and this conversation, as Geeta mentioned, we're really looking to further these kinds of conversations and develop an inclusive, inspired civic agenda for the city of Cambridge. And so just to ground us, Cambridge really is the place where innovation thrives and new ideas are nurtured and championed. And it is truly a leading innovation city. Much of our impact gets obscured by metro level data that includes Boston. But when you drill down into the primary cities of the metro, the Brookings superstar metro, innovation superstar metros, you see that Cambridge actually ranks #1 in terms of the share of adults who are employed in the innovation occupation cluster. Almost 7 percentage points higher than places like Seattle and San Jose, and even 10 percentage points higher than San Francisco. And this new Cambridge really is thriving in the innovation economy. We rank at or near the top of almost every metric of competitive advantage. #1 in employment, #1 most highly educated population with more PhDs than any other city, #2 in growth of young knowledge workers. 3 of the nation's top 20 zip codes for venture capital investment are located in Cambridge alone. And we had the 4th highest median household income and the fastest growing median household income over the last decade. And this really has been a dynamic decade that saw an explosion in Cambridge, not just in innovation, where jobs in scientific R&D actually grew by 80%, but we saw growth in total businesses and jobs, and we saw the population itself grow to over 118,000, which is the highest, our largest number since 1950. And growth and prosperity, where the median household income increased 28% over the last decade, outpacing statewide growth for the first time. And as a result, we are an immensely resource-rich community. More than 1 in 5 households in Cambridge earns over $200,000 a year. And in 2018, residents earned a combined $5 billion, while jobs in Cambridge generated over $18 billion in wages. And properties in Cambridge have been valued at over $32 billion as the city attracts more people and more investment residentially. And yet, Cambridge is very much a story of juxtapositions, an intertwining of success and shortfall, wealth and poverty, dynamism and disposition. And what we see is that our successes and challenges really track along with other innovation cities. In addition to this innovation-driven abundance, we also have the 7th largest gap between incomes at the bottom and the top quintiles, a gap of about over $300,000. We're also leading in housing costs. We have the 3rd highest home values and the #1 highest average monthly rents among all the cities that we looked at. And during this dynamic decade of growth, Cambridge actually lost families and households with children and now has the smallest child population of all of the innovation cities. And Cambridge, like many other innovation cities, is becoming much more diverse, adding double-digit growth among Latinx, Asian, and multiracial residents, though seeing some stagnation of the African American and Black population. And with this, we see deep disparities in who is sharing in the prosperity. Here we see that while the bottom 20% of households earn just 2.25% of all of the income in Cambridge in 2018, the top 20% of households actually earned half of all of the income. And despite the fact that the average household in Cambridge now earns almost 6 figures, The average Black household earns just a third of that at a little over $33,000 annually. And this is seeing an almost negligible increase over the last decade, despite this dynamic citywide growth across the board. And so to better understand these inequities, we decided with this report to look at the population in quintiles, or even 20% shares of people in households. And this allowed us to identify with greater nuance how these changes are occurring in Cambridge and how they've played out at a more fine-grained level from the bottom to the middle to the top of the economic ladder. So I'm just going to spend a few minutes letting you absorb some of the information about what we found about who lives in each one of these quintiles. The first quintile is the population is the most ethnically diverse, 30% Black with average household incomes of just over $13,000. Most single parent households, highly cost burdened, but long-term residents, working largely in the service sector, which was hardest hit by the pandemic. The second quintile has the largest share of immigrants. Average household incomes are about $50,000. Recent movers with the greatest increase in education credentialing. These folks are employed largely in education and the nonprofit sector. And the profile of this quintile has actually changed very little over the last 10 years. The third or middle quintile is really reflective of the new Cambridge, with an average household income of about $95,000. Increasingly diverse, this is 40% of those in this group are millennials. Only 10% of households have children. The middle quintile actually saw a loss of Black households down from about 9% to 6% over time. And the population in this quintile is very highly mobile, with almost half who have not lived at the same address for 2 years. They are also a growing share of the innovation economy. Quintile 4 looks pretty similar to what it looked like a decade ago. Predominantly white, well-educated mid-career professionals with incomes averaging about $151,000. People in this quintile are largely double-income, no children households, 60% renters, and mostly able to afford housing. This fairly stable population is employed largely in the innovation sector. And the top quintile households earn on average about $343,000. They're most likely to be two-parent households with children, majority homeowners, and they're working in the top tier professions of management, finance, and legal occupations. Oh, excuse me. Oh, sorry about that. And when stacked against each other, these quintiles highlight three glaring facts. Number one, a third of our seniors are poor. Children are highly polarized in the bottom and the top quintiles, and the traditional middle class made up of family households has been replaced by a growing millennial population. It also reveals very stark racial inequities. Comparisons across quintiles show that 80% of residents in the top quintile are white. 40% of all Black residents in Cambridge now live in the bottom tier of households. Asian residents have made the most gains over time in the top and middle quintiles, while Latinx residents have made the largest gains in the middle and bottom quintiles. And housing affordability has been a growing concern for the first, second, and some of those in the middle quintile. 56% of renters and 60% of owners in the lowest income households spend half of their income on housing costs. And disparities in educational outcomes deepen the opportunity gap. So just 45% of adults in the lowest income households have a bachelor's degree or higher. This means that in a city, the most highly educated innovation city, half of adults in the bottom tier lack the education credentials necessary for success in our knowledge-based economy. And this is affecting access to the innovation economy. In a city where 22% of adults work in this sector, just 8.5% of adults in the bottom quintile have broken into this growing, booming innovation sector. And notably, this is actually a slightly lower rate than the first quintile a decade ago, while almost every other quintile, particularly the middle and the fourth, have experienced major growth in employment here. And this is also contributing to deep racial equity gaps in the city. Compared to 22% citywide, less than 5% of Black adults in Cambridge are employed in the innovation sector. And this is really strong, a key contributor to that key racial income gap of $62,000 of Black households compared to citywide households that we highlighted earlier. And if things weren't tough enough for our low income and Black and brown communities before the pandemic, COVID really has only made it worse. Like communities across the country, COVID has disproportionately impacted Cambridge's residents of color, who comprise just about 40% of the population, but over 60% of all cases. And as job losses mounted and unemployment skyrocketed, that we saw the need for food and other assistance increase as well. And an estimated 1 in 8 Cambridge households are now, and residents are now food insecure. And also as school and work moved to virtual spaces like the Zoom that we're on today, it's important to note that 11% of Black and Latinx households lack the internet in Cambridge, a city that is home to the largest tech companies in the world. And so as we think about the implications of this data and these inequities and the future of Cambridge as we emerge from the pandemic, we wanted to reflect upon this quote from one of the 20 individuals that we interviewed for the report. And it really mirrors a persistent refrain we heard from so many, that we want to be able to take this moment and seek within the crisis an opportunity to grow Cambridge in a more equitable way over the next 10 years. So this is where we hope to start the conversation about how we can look at the patterns of the last 10 years and think through what the next 10 years might look like if infusing equity in the conversation. With that, I will turn it back to, there we go.
Thank you.
Geeta. Sure, thank you.
So thank you, Jessica, for giving us sort of the big picture and a little peek into the data. As I mentioned, we are going to make sure that you have access to the website link, as well as if you want hard copies of the report, please request that through the link. And now on to our esteemed panel. I'm going to introduce our panelists and start with Mayor Sumbul Siddiqui. She's currently serving her second term as the Cambridge City Council and her first term as Mayor of Cambridge. She's also chair of the Cambridge School Committee. A fierce advocate of issues of equity and justice. Mayor Siddiqui launched the Cambridge Youth Council 18 years ago and has continued that work first through her work as a legal aid attorney and most recently as mayor of this wonderful city. She continues to promote affordable housing and address the region's broader affordability crisis, and has worked alongside the city manager in leading Cambridge, the Cambridge community during the COVID-19 pandemic, including launching the Mayor's Disaster Relief Fund, which was a $5 million fund. And I'm sure you've heard stories about all the wonderful things it is supporting. Artists, small businesses, families with rent and utility costs. She introduced the Tenants' Rights and Resources Notification Act, worked to increase internet access to low-income families to equitably participate in remote learning, eliminated library fines that disproportionately affect low-income residents and families of color, and collaborated with the Cambridge Health Alliance to expand free COVID testing to all Cambridge residents. And that's all in the COVID year. So, she's been very busy. I have to tell you that I often try to get hold of her, and she's in meetings till midnight, along with many other city councillors. So thank you a lot for all you do every day, Mayor Siddiqui. Next, I'll introduce Reverend Irene Monroe. She is a nationally acclaimed activist, ordained minister, lesbian, feminist, public theologian, and a religion columnist. That's She can be heard on the podcast and standing Boston Public Radio segment of All Revved Up on WGBH 89.7 FM. Reverend Monroe is a visiting scholar in the Religion and Conflict Transformation Program at Boston University School of Theology and the Boston Voice for Detours African American Heritage Trail. As an activist, she has received numerous awards, including the 2020 Dr. Susan M. Love Award, 2019 Boston's 25 Most Influential LGBTQ+ People of Color Award, the 2017 Cambridge Mayor's Luminary Award, Her papers are at the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe College's Research Library on the History of Women in America. And last, and definitely not the least, is Dr. Thomas Shapiro, David R. Pocross Professor of Law and Social Policy at the Heller School for Social Policy at Brandeis University. Professor Shapiro's primary interest is in racial inequality in public policy, with a particular focus on closing the racial wealth gap. He has authored and co-authored several groundbreaking studies, including the award-winning Black Wealth, White Wealth, which received the 1997 Distinguished Scholarly Publication Award from the American Sociological Association. Other works include The Hidden Cost of Being African American, How Wealth Perpetuates Inequality in 2004, and The Roots of the Widening Racial Wealth Gap, Explaining the Black-White Economic Divide. In 2011, he was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to study the wealth gap in South Africa. Dr. Shapiro's most recent book, Toxic Inequality, How America's Wealth Gap Deepens the Racial Divide and Threatens Our Future, was in 2017. An active social media presence, he has been interviewed by and has his work discussed in major media outlets, including New York Times, The Washington Post, the Boston Globe, CNN, ABC, BBC, MSNBC, and NPR. So welcome our wonderful panelists. Oh my God, what a powerhouse of people, and what a wealth of knowledge and ideas. So I would actually like to start with a question to each one of you about what you found most surprising about the report. Because, you know, in some sense, this is pretty usual data, you know, it's expected. You know, we know these things, but what is it that struck you about this report? And maybe we'll start with you, Mayor Siddiqui.
Sure. It's great to be here, everyone, and with my fellow panelists. Thank you so much to the Cambridge Community Foundation for all that you've done. You know, for me, I think having grown up in the city and grown up in Cambridge affordable housing here, I think I found the reports, you know, I think the data was still striking in some ways. I think, of course, I've seen firsthand about who has benefited in our society by prosperity, and who benefits in our city and who doesn't. And, you know, I've seen the ways our city is so full of opportunity, but then also falls short. And I think that comes through in the report. And I think it made me reflect about the Cambridge that existed maybe, you know, even 10 years ago, even 20 years ago, you know, and how massively Cambridge is growing, and how it has grown as a hub for innovation, and what that growth has meant, right? And I think there's a lot of, with growth, I think from this report, I've seen, wow, it comes with a lot of work to be done, because that growth on the one hand has made our city this hub, and at the same time we're seeing the trends that we're seeing, and we're seeing how you know, people are in the margins, and now even going further in the margins, and how those gaps are widening. So I think the report illustrates, you know, I wasn't too surprised, but I think it was still like, wow, you know, I knew it was bad, but it really, for me, you know, it kind of highlighted the things that I was already, I kind of knew, but it really put into perspective just how quickly things have changed, and how we have to really act to, you know, address these inequities.
Reverend Monroe, what are your thoughts?
I should know how to unmute myself by now. Okay. Well, let me say a couple of things. First of all, thank you for inviting me in this conversation, and I'm so delighted to be on this panel here. I found it sobering and unsurprising. So I come to Cambridge like so many who come, and my spouse here, either to go to Harvard and my spouse, you know, getting a medical residency up here. But in the 20-some years that Thea and I have resided here in Cambridge, we're not surprised to see what has developed. because Cambridge has always been attractive before it became an innovative and big pharma hub here. The schools in and of itself bring us here. I think that what we find interesting here is two things. We have resided, and not in the port, now it's called the port, Area 4, where Black folks are designated and Latinx people are designated. We have resided in Middle Cambridge for 20 plus years, and we are still the only Black homeowners in the area. And when I say area, I don't mean like down the block. I mean like the area, the area. And then the closest we come to is Professor Henry Louis Gates. And so the thing that troubles me about this is that this is nothing new. So and the thing about us living here, we had to tell folks here when we moved here, we're not the cleaning women. We should clean our house, but we're not the cleaning women, you know. And so one of the things that when I look at this, that it's wonderful that we want to do something. I wonder if it's a day late and a dollar short, as we say. I'm concerned about a couple of things. The intentionality. Do you really, you know, as they say, do you really want change? What does it mean that here is your house sell for 1.2 million and you have a Black family who's living in subsidized housing? Do you want that person next to you? So that's another one. The other thing that we really got to understand here is that Cambridge is segregated. It's very, very interesting. We talk about, I always tell people this, that what the Mason-Dixon line does is this: if you're below it, it's down south. If you're above it, it is up south. Cambridge shows its face around segregation, not with placards, the iconic Jim Crow placards, but they show it in terms of squares, what square you reside in, and what zip code. Case in point, Professor Henry Louis Gates lived in the wrong zip code as well as square. So that brings suspicion when he was trying to get into his house. But another thing here is that you got to look at, why is it that when Black folks do come here, we don't stay? And one of it has to do that there's nothing about Cambridge that makes you feel welcome. Just as policing is a problem here in the country, the most notorious and ridiculous case that is really another pox on Cambridge is the 2009 arrest of Professor Henry Louis Gates, which everybody knows. And let me just say this: Cambridge feels like this. It feels like I'm in Cheers, because everybody knows your name because we like flies in a bowl of milk. So I want to just boil it down. Intentionality? What are you going to really do about segregation here? And what are you going to do about policing? Because until you can do that, then Black folks and Latinx folks can blossom and feel that they have a place in this, you know, this blossoming city.
All right, Tom, let's hear your thoughts.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for hearing my words this evening, and really sincere congratulations to Jessica and the team. I'm sure there was a team that really put that report together. It's the brilliance of the work really shines through. And I hope everybody in Cambridge gets a chance not just to read it, but to talk about it. A number of things really stood out in addition to what's already been lifted up. For me, what really drove home is the work on the quintiles in the report, and how the quintiles really project the economic and racial segregation in the city of Cambridge. And it is like there are 5 different countries there in some ways, with not a whole lot of transit between them, especially from the so-called first quintile or the bottom one to the others. The other phenomenon that really stood out to me is thinking about how the innovation sector here in Cambridge, and maybe Boston Metro a little more generally, is really the driving force, especially in Cambridge, around this sort of economic segregation and the disparity gaps that have clearly widened. And it's interesting Interesting is a really bad word here, but it's intriguing that there's Cambridge, if we look at Cambridge as a space, it's an incredibly rich opportunity space with incredible assets and prosperity. And a lot of that prosperity is relatively new, especially in terms of the high quality jobs that come with that prosperity. But as the report clearly shows, whole populations have been left out of that prosperity. So for me, the real lift up is to acknowledge and think about how that has happened and what policies have allowed that to happen, but more so, what's the next report going to look like in 5 years, in 10 years? How can we determine whether progress has been made on what we are going to construct as equity? And how are we going to hold stakeholders' feet to the fire to make that happen if it doesn't happen? So those are the things, and they're more analytical than particular data points, but that's that's what jumped out at me with the report.
Thank you all. I think, frankly, to me too, the thing that was the most stunning was the racial disparities and how the African-American Black community had just not moved forward. If you look at the income growth, minimal growth for that community. And so actually, Irene, I'd like to put that the next question to you, that, the report clearly shows that, the differences when you're adults, but it also shows how disparities begin at a very early age and then sustain through generations. What do you think explains that? I think you've said some of those things, but I want to actually really sort of have that conversation about, and I think, Tom, you sort of referred to a little bit about what were the policies that led to that. And I think we need to confront those things. And I would love to hear you talk a little bit about, the racism, implicit and explicit. What do you think can be done to change? I mean, I know you're sort of a little pessimistic about it, but if you were to make a, wish for, what would you change about them? What do you think we can do about it?
Well, first, let me say this, Geeta. I think that the report is brilliant. This is the most comprehensive look that we've had to really look at racial disparities here. So you can't argue the numbers here. Yeah. So whether you want to say opportunities are here, okay, we understand it's not trickling down to a particular demographic group. So what I love about it is that the report, you cannot argue. I just thought the report was brilliant. It's sobering. It's what Black folks knew before the report came out. So this is a report for white Cambridge, because this is nothing new because of the lived reality. So when we talk about educational parity, it troubles me that a child growing up in Cambridge, and particularly in Area 4 that we now call the port, because it's been gentrified with big tech and big pharma and Cambridge innovation companies, that they have as less of a chance of getting into any of these schools here in the hub than a child from the Mississippi Delta. Now that is pretty tragic, and I'm not being hyperbolic. So when we talk about educational parity, what are we talking about? We're talking about a couple of things here. We're talking about the tentacles in which that a child can thrive here. So while educational is quote unquote important, then the kid needs a place to live. Let's just look at the kid. Let's look at the household. What are the services that we provide? But then also we got to look at the psychological development of living in a society where a child is policed. It is tragic. We say it's tragic, but we do nothing about it. Now, the problem about it is that we got to address anti-Latinx and anti-Black racism, because you can be an immigrant. You can be an immigrant from certain parts of the world, be poor and thrive. Get at least a little piece of the American dream. You got to begin to look at this kind of, you call it a glass ceiling, the systemic structure of racism. We got to understand that that we hear about structural racism. We got to see what that looks like. So let's look at Cambridge Rindge and Latin. That should be a level playing field. But I've heard students talk about how white professors, I'm sorry, well, this is at Harvard. I'm thinking of my time at Harvard. Okay, white teachers, have low expectations of them. It sort of looks like when students are asking for, Black studies, not just Black History Month, but Black studies being incorporated in the historical history and English curriculum. Listen, the school board, they've been arguing this forever. So the real issue is intentionality. Do you want me and Thea living next to you? Now you do, because it's cachet to say, oh, do you know the Rev and the doctor? But my point is, if we were working if we really were cleaning women, would you really want us? And that is the question. Oh, it's chic now, because if you come anywhere 5 blocks within where we live and you say, I'm looking for Irene or they're going to tell you how articulate we are. They're going to tell you where we live. So that's the point. Do you really want people of a different income, of a different race, really living side by side? And what white people do is this, liberals do, they will just move. See, it's called white flight. And what they do is, if they don't like the public school system, they put them in private schools.
So, this is actually very interesting because, at one level, Cambridge is an incredibly progressive city. If you look at, I worked in Boston for many years, and I see the contrast in Cambridge about things that government will pick up and take on. The conversation, for instance, about race in schools that happened, and also, so I actually wonder whether, particularly with a very progressive mayor who has been pushing the envelope on a lot of these issues, at the level of a city leader, Mayor Siddiqui, you're looking at this global powerhouse of a community, and in some sense, I feel like, maybe we need to retain our power and our, the privilege and power that Cambridge has. But at the same time, there is this other side of the community that's quirky, that's has persistent poverty, that has, so how do you balance these things, as a city leader? And what mechanisms do you think Cambridge possesses to be able to link prosperity to communities?
Yeah, so
it's a very telling response.
So I do want to just say that, like, as someone who, was an immigrant here, I think what, the Reverend has said, I've benefited, right? I think there is a lot of anti-Blackness, and as an Asian woman, and yes, I was, low income, but I think I was one of those students at Cambridge Rindge and Latin that I think I figured it out, right? But so many of my friends didn't, and I think it went back to a lot of the issues that you've just talked about. So I wanted to lift that up. That I, as someone who's made it here, I think I didn't face the same obstacles, even if there are some obstacles that came in the way. It was not the same obstacles that my peers of color face. So I wanted to acknowledge that. And I think about that a lot in the work that I do now. And especially during the pandemic, I think I've seen firsthand really who calls my office and who needs help, and why they need help. And it's been a real challenge to think about these policy solutions when I feel like the city has had a hard time with, I'll say we have a lot of money in the city, and I think there's a constant issue around how we use it and how we use it to benefit the people who actually need it. And I think there's a disconnect there. But I think what I've seen is that it is important to have some cross-sector collaboration. I don't think the city can solve some of these issues alone. I think it's going to take partnerships with organizations, with our educational institutions, with our philanthropic community, with our nonprofit organizations, our local businesses, and so forth, to actually find a solution to some of our city's most pressing issues. But again, I have so many examples of things where I know it's a need. Internet, for example. We know people don't have internet. We knew what's this pandemic's really highlighted for me is that we knew when we had to go remote that kids didn't have computers at home. We knew that, but we hadn't done anything. We knew that kids didn't have the internet at home. So we were able to say, okay, well, we got to figure this problem out. And, I think something I also realized in this, I'm kind of answering your question, but what I've seen is there's stuff that we've been so hesitant to do that we should have been doing. And I think this report kind of highlights to me too, like, you think about the next report, I'm like, we need to have municipal broadband. We need to make sure that the families who don't have internet right now have internet. Like there's things that are actually, I think, doable, but it's going to really require some more partnership and really willpower to do. So I'm exhausted, so I'm not making much sense, but
No,
that kind of covers some of it.
Yeah. And I think maybe, Tom, I'd love to sort of turn to you to say that as we are looking at these issues of racial justice and equity, and I really want to put racial justice ahead of anything, and with all of the work that you have done, what kind of a filter can we place on the work that we do that addresses the concerns that are lifted up in the report? How do we do that? What kind of an index or something? I mean, we need to all have some tools so that we are measuring what we do, because there's a lot of good intentions, but somehow they don't, 10 years later, you're seeing the indicators go in the wrong direction instead of the right direction. And this is when people are well-intentioned. God forbid what would happen, if he had someone who was different, like someone who just got out of office.
Thank you, Geeta, for the easy question. So we do need, in my very strong view, we do need a North Star. And we need a North Star about where it is that we want to be heading and the ways in which we can intentionally head in that direction. And I do think, the Reverend's notation several times about intentionality is right on. We really do have to want to solve the issue or come close to solving it in a way that will make us much happier with Cambridge as a community. I think there is a way. Thank you for the musical interlude. Back to your regularly scheduled programming. I was about to say, is this the musical version of Zoom bombing? Yeah, well, they could have picked some other music to do that, is about all I'll say. Several cities have begun to explore the equivalent of racial justice filters. And by that, I mean, first of all, figuring out what it is that the city, in this instance of Cambridge, actually has some control over. Because there are a lot of things, unfortunately, that the city of Cambridge doesn't. But, is in terms of that old saying, let's figure out what it is that we actually have some control over and work on those and lobby and advocate for those that we don't have control over. So the city of Seattle, for example, has an equity filter. Boston has tinkered with an equity filter. Almost all of them, I think, in my view, are pretty limited in that they tend to deal with procurement, supply, issues around how things are bought. I think we can go a lot further than that. I think that we can even think of something, and nobody gasp, something like an equity rating that businesses and institutions would need to post on their door like restaurants do with their own rating. And the equity rating could be built around, hypothetically, something like, is there equity in ownership? What does management look like demographically? Is there a pipeline for training workers? What is who do they buy things from? What does their supply chain look like? Have they spun off? Have they incubated enterprises? And as a way to encourage equity, good citizenship within the community, and to use a bit of shaming power if it's posted on a front door, so other people can look at it and make decisions. And I'd even perhaps go one step further in that a lot of businesses do contractual work with the city in one way or another. And perhaps if your score is needs to be above a certain number to be able to do business with the city, or it has to improve over time. So I would think about those notions of building, if you will, an equity index. And they're going to tend to be not goalposts, but they're going to tend to be how far or near you are to that goal. So if your goalpost, for example, is a diverse workforce that mirrors the city or the metropolitan area, where are you on that particular metric? And I think, smart people like Jessica and others can help put that together and see what's been done around the country and construct that for Cambridge. You're muted, Geeta, you're muted at the time.
Okay, unmute myself. Okay, sorry about that. That was the bomber's fault, not mine. So, Mayor Siddiqui, you've done a lot of work around affordable housing, and housing affordability, I think, is actually the bigger issue, not affordable housing, because by default, we are creating a tale of two cities, those who are very poor and those who are very wealthy and can buy into homes and housing here. I'd love to hear your thoughts about, how we can retain, and whether there is any possibility to, again, I think it's an issue of either, if some of it is legally what can do, and the other one is what is the will that we have to do about increasing, I think, home ownership, which is something that we're building a lot of rental housing everywhere. And rental housing is typically controlled by the person who owns it, and they tend to be more developers and investors. And so I'm just curious about how the city is thinking about the idea of home ownership, and if we can build home ownership, like for Black families, for instance. Any conversations around that?
Yeah, I think we have a number of these city homeownership programs, but I think there's two things with that. I think the homeownership that we have is, if you buy it from the city, you have to go into a deed restricted. It's restricted, and it kind of says you can't sell it back for profit and you can't pass it down. And those are the things that with homeownership are key, right? That's fundamental.
Yeah,
so
yeah.
I think that the big issue with our homeownership programs, what we've seen is what they do is for families who, their report highlights, so many families are paying, over 50% of their income towards rent and so forth. These options at least allow families to stay in the city. And what I've seen it do is at least they then allow families to then move out of Cambridge because they've been able to save, and then they get to go, they'll buy a house in Woburn and Lowell. So we do see that happen, and I think that's a good thing. It's in the sense that I wish they didn't have to leave Cambridge, but at least there's a pathway, and they have the right to choose that, okay, we want to move out of Cambridge now that we have the option to buy a bigger space. I think with that said, we're losing families, and who we're losing Black families. You're losing many families of color, and it's a big problem. And I think we've at the city level, we haven't fixed that problem. What we are invested in doing is building more affordable housing, and I think one of the things that we haven't really been doing, and one thing that I've been pushing is, the city owns a lot of their own land, and I think because of that, I think we have the chance to be innovative and perhaps actually provide opportunities for like actual home ownership And I think, again, that goes back to what the city, some of the property that we have also received has been donated by educational institutions and so forth. But we literally for years were sitting on it and have not done anything with it. So I air this out to say, there's stuff we could be doing, and I think we can be innovative, and maybe that's one option. But I think there's weaknesses in our homeownership programs. But I do think there are potential ways to rectify that, but we just haven't been doing it.
I think one other thing that I would love to get your thoughts on is that if you look at the pressures and the growth of the city, it is being driven by the business sector, by the innovation companies, by biotech companies. How are we holding them accountable to deal with the issue of housing? Because if you look at what happened in Seattle, what has happened in San Francisco, these companies have put in billions of dollars to build housing for their employees. And I'm curious about what we are doing or what we can do, because we may need to support you in making that case with the business community, but I do think that they need to be held accountable for this or be a partner in this.
Yeah, so this has been interesting. So I'm new to politics and new to the council, and but I think this is where it goes back to the council and the city government. We have something called an incentive zoning ordinance, which was established in 1988, through which developers who are seeking special permits, to increase the density or intensity of use of, their development above what's required, they're required to make a housing contribution in return for such permits. This rate for years was as little as $2, right? And then it increased to $4. And then the council actually had an opportunity to increase it, and they didn't because they were afraid that development would slow down. That did not happen. And so finally the council, I think, it was, I think my year, we said we need to, it was before me, but they finally increased it. And now we keep increasing it because it was not increased enough. So we lost out on millions of dollars, because we were not requiring enough of these developers because we were afraid that development would slow down. So I think, yes, we have mechanisms where developers are paying into funds, they pay into the Affordable Housing Trust and so forth. And we have the inclusionary zoning ordinance as well. And that was at 10%. Now it's at 20% as of a few years ago. But again, that progress, if you think about it, if you think about the history and you think about the report and the timing, like we kind of, when we should have been doing it, we didn't. And now we're here. And we're, in the last few years, we've finally been increasing and demanding more of developers. But I wish we had gone and done that in the past.
Yeah, and actually I was thinking more about companies like Google and Microsoft. And I mean, it's companies that are actually putting in a lot of money to housing. But I think we are coming to a point where we'd love to actually engage the audience in the question and answer. So I wanted to actually end with one question that I was triggered off by one of the podcasts I saw on your show, Irene, where you talk about a Black utopia. And I think, the pandemic has actually given us an opportunity to reset some thinking. And there is with the Black Lives Matter movement and the pandemic, I think a lot of people are open and rethinking because people have sort of firsthand encountered poverty in Cambridge or the stress in Cambridge. And I think there's an openness to looking at some things. I'd love for you to describe, just to give us a sliver of the vision of what that utopia might look like. And then I would love for Tom, you, and to, maybe talk about if there were one or two things that had a domino effect on change, what would those be? And Sumbul, from your end, to hear about what it might take to achieve that. What could the city do to achieve that? So.
Okay, well,
Irene.
thank you. Thank you for listening to that particular segment here. First of all, there would not be a Black utopia here in Cambridge. You talk about white flight, oh, they'd be gone in a minute. So
But what if it was? What if there was?
that's not even possible, because then you would have to say that racism doesn't exist.
Okay. That's a
And
great
then what
one.
would happen is that it pits different groups of color. So
Okay.
if it's not the Black folks, then it'll be the Latinx, then it'll be the Southeast Asians. I mean, it really is. That's just the
Yeah.
mechanism of racism. But this is what I do want to say here. Although I know that I'm a bit pessimistic, because I've resided here all these years and have not, seen any improvement. I've seen things devolve. But this is what I do want to say here. We have lost a substantial number of a Black population. We do not just in Cambridge, and of all places, I thought Cambridge would have it, which is one of the reasons why she and I moved here. We thought, of all places, Cambridge would have a Black middle class, a solid Black middle class. We do not have that. So one of the things that's very problematic, so these kids don't see Black doctors, you know what I mean? Don't see Black engineers, because you have to see someone like you to believe that you can actually actualize that. So that too is a problem of representation in terms of Black professionals. But the other problem here, in terms of just, we don't have Black representation, is that you're not at this point going to get people say, you know what, we ought to move to Cambridge. Because truth be told, when we get to retirement age, which is just a stone throw away, we're moving to St. Croix, to our house in St. Croix. So the point is this here. What you want to do is, how do you treat the folks that are here? Okay. And they're here because at this point, they can't go anyplace else. And that is the God and honest truth here. Because people who have access to money, have disposable money, we're not going to stay up in here. There's nothing, listen, there's no redeeming factor to stay up here, because even if you can afford to be here, which we can, you got to deal with policing. You got to deal with your neighbor, So these are the sort of things that are, listen, I'm gonna tell you something. I had wanted to buy Venus. Venus was a Black hair product store on Prospect Street. It was owned by this white guy, and he was going out of business. I said, let me buy it. I said, let me buy it from you. I said, because listen, I know about Black hair. Okay? I know how to get folks to come. Let me tell you one of the reasons why they didn't want it. They were afraid, given my popularity, okay, I would have a tsunami of Black people coming from Roxbury, Dorchester to come to Venus. Absurd. Since I've been here, there's only been one Black homegrown business, this selling chicken, okay? The main drag that used to look like a drag, that when you built it up, nary a Black business on the drag. So there is no hope for any kind of Black prosperity, even if you want to invest in something Black here. Because folks worry about, this is what it was, they were very honest. They worried about a tsunami of Black folks, okay? And I was going to change it from Venus to Irene's, okay? A tsunami of Black folks getting off, at Central Square, going to get some hair grease, okay? So again, we got to look at those sort of things. There's no encouragement. It's wonderful conversation, but there's no encouragement for those of us who have money and want to do something in the community. So that's what I'm saying. There has to be intentionality. There has to be a kind of an intersectional kind of activism around helping Black folks, the few of us that want to invest here.
Okay, so I'm actually a real optimist.
Keep hope alive.
I feel like in the conversations that I've been hearing around the city, I do see a real willingness and openness amongst many quarters, like even amongst the business community, to talk about doing something about issues of equity and racial justice. So I'm going to go with the fact that, yes, as you said, it needs intentionality. It needs a mindset change. So the vision in my mind is a Cambridge where people are willing, they are open, they are and accessible to these kinds of ideas. But if there are a couple of things that we were to be able to take on that had a domino effect on change, other than the intentionality and a mindset change, which is actually the highest level of systemic change that you can create, is if you can create mindset change. Tom, what would those things be? Or how do we go about creating a mindset change? What have you seen in other cities that has actually accomplished that?
I don't know any city that's actually accomplished it.
Not accomplished, but has done better.
But that's not to be the skeptic, but it's to confront the reality.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can tick off three things pretty quickly. The innovation and gap report is really important. At the same time, there needs to be a companion narrative and framing about why those statistics and quintiles exist. Otherwise, even some semi-good intentioned people are going to look at the data and say, oh, I know why, and regurgitate back all of the dominant racist narratives and others about individual characteristics or group characteristics. So I do think there's got to be a companion campaign with getting the report out that talks about narrative and framing. Second, housing security. We've talked about housing a bit. I don't think it's too far-fetched to say that the dramatic increase in housing cost burden in the city of Cambridge is not because people it's not because there's less in the paycheck. It's because the cost of housing to buy it or to rent it is zooming up with the prosperity in the area. So it's a crisis that literally has been caused by that kind of prosperity, and I dare say the unregulated, uncontrolled way in which housing costs have been allowed to rise. Now, again, I'm not sure, the mechanisms that a city has on that are relatively limited, but I think they've got to be reimagined. Third, somewhat quickly, hopefully, with all of the innovation economy in the city of Cambridge, businesses serve them. Somebody brings food in, somebody cleans it, somebody supplies the petri dishes, somebody supplies everything that goes into those businesses. And that's where I would try and capture or think about a chain or supply side strategy to have those become residents, entrepreneurs, businesses of color in the city of Cambridge. And I think there's some pressure points to do that.
All right, great. Sumbul, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it's been covered, but I think about, I started at City Hall too, right? It's a pretty white place. And, I think there's a lot that the city can do when it comes to hiring, right? I think, you talk about teachers too. We have a workforce that's over 70% teachers who are white, right? How are we, you can't be what you can't see. And the schools have said, we're committed to diversity, and our percentages of teachers of color are growing, right? But these are all tangible things that we can be doing, and be committed to. So, I think about our hiring. I think with respect to what Tom has mentioned, I think, we have this directory of women and minority-owned businesses in Cambridge. But again, if we did an analysis about how many of, I think, even our city's contracts, who we use, right? Like, I think, there's a lot of change that probably, it can happen. And I know there's meetings about it, and there's things that are slowly happening. But I think these are some things that we can really, have a true impact on people's lives if we actually change some of these policies. Another area I think about, and I just had it in my head, but it just fell out. It just fell out of my head. But I think there is a lot around, I think, who our city hires and hiring practices. Oh, boards and commissions, right? Like boards and commissions. over 70% white, right? You know, why aren't we paying, you know, it reflects on who has power and who can be involved and who shows up to council meetings and school committee meetings, and, you know, how do we make it accessible? How, you know, I think we need to be paying people. You know, there's all these other things that we can be also doing to kind of change who has a say in our city. So those are just some things, but it's, you know, I feel you, Reverend, on a lot of it. I mean, I try to, as a policymaker, I'm like here, and I'm like, sometimes I'm like, I want to retire early because I just feel like I
No,
don't think,
don't do that.
I feel
We need
sometimes
to-
I'm like, I don't think there's anything we can do. So.
Okay, so we're going to turn to audience questions, and there is one question that we have, and I hope it's okay that if I'm identifying the person who is asking the question, Rosemary Johnson. Okay, great. Rosemary has a question about how do we engage those people of color with resources to invest and engage? Wouldn't it be great if Black and Brown Canterburyans were watching this and part of the discussion? I know this is not easy to answer, but we need to engage those neighbors. Irene, I'm going to turn to you to see what your thoughts are on, you know, how we can engage people of color who have the resources, who have the, you know, power, who have the voice, because a lot of our neighbors don't.
Yeah, but what you need is a critical mass of us. See, that's the point. So if you let's look at Harvard, for instance, here. So you got some who teach at Harvard and live, you know, in the Tony section of Harvard, the 02138 area. Skip for one. And you got Cornell, but Cornell is leaving. So your academics, they have a transient kind of life. So you're talking about someone like me and Fee who just we plopped here, okay? But you know, you like, again, we don't have a critical mass that would say this is your Black middle class or if professional class, whatever you want to call us. We don't have that, because now, like, the house at the corner goes for 1.2 million.
Mm-hmm. So, you know, I mean, I'd love to hear any thoughts that Tom or Sumbul you have. But one of the things that I did want to point out is that one of the things this report showed is that Cambridge's diversity actually grew. Latinx population almost doubled. The Asian population grew a lot too. And the Black population really, I mean, was stagnant. You know, I think that's, it's a real concern that we are losing the Black middle class. So, you know, given the fact, I think, how do we create that kind of a critical mass? How do we, you know, what are your thoughts about engaging people of color in the conversations about change?
So I have a thought. If I could throw a few things out, thank you. You know, I hate to be the little bomb thrower here, and the white Jewish boy from Beverly Hills is probably not the right one to throw the bomb. However, we shouldn't be asking the well-to-do African American Latinx communities to, you know, what it is can you do?
Yeah.
They should be setting, they and others in the community should be setting the table.
Yeah.
Perhaps there should be a listening tour rather than a talking tour for reports like this, to hear what the community has to say. And I think that in some ways, maybe the most value that well-to-do business people and professionals of color can contribute here is not their money, but their time. But their time in being the face of campaigns, in being the examples, in being those people that others want to emulate, and showing how the care is not just about the pocketbook, but it's about the heart, and it's about the community as well. I think the ask has got to be from those that are extracting the most amount of wealth out of the infrastructure that Cambridge has created for their prosperity, the corporations.
Mm-hmm. Great. Sumbul, do you have any thoughts on that, or you want to pass? You move on to the next.
I
question.
agree with Tom that this conversation, it's like this conversation needs to be done with the Black residents of Cambridge, and see what they want, what they want, But to get to your point, Tom, we're so few in number. If you say professional class or whatever. And it's not that we're not there, because you folks will call me for anything. I mean, it's like I'm everywhere, but nowhere. So, but that's just because there's so few. There's just so few. But it would be nice that, I think one of the ways you get people to stay is they feel secure. And one is, I'm on the police task force. How do you stop profiling people? How do you stop when Miss Ann or Karen calls the cop and get hysterical that there's a Black person, breaking into his or her house? So, I mean, it's just so many tentacles that have to be done simultaneously, which is why I said it needs not only intentionality, but an intersectional kind of approach.
Great. Great. Okay, so there's another question, which is much more, I think, probably directed at you, Mayor. Since the panel has touched on this, but could you comment on whether city government could use residential zoning to help middle and lower cost housing? I, as a middle income person, have at every level of my career been priced out of Cambridge. And that question comes from Mary Catherine Dybell.
It's a great question. I think it's a question that, unfortunately, it's not as simple as I think. We talk about a lot about supply and demand when it comes to this, and we've been having a lot of conversations with respect to, getting rid of some of the restrictive zoning that we have in parts of the city that is only single family, for example, and you can't build, three deckers and so forth. But, I think that there's been such exclusionary zoning, and I think that goes back, there's, to Tom's point, there's a historical, there's a lot of history here in terms of our zoning in Cambridge too, and where things have been built, who's been left out, why people are where they are now. It's all connected. And I think there is some movement and some discussion that the council has been having around getting rid of zoning, but who we're hearing from, right? We're hearing from folks who are the homeowners who are well off, who are saying, any attempt at some kind of residential zoning is actually going to, in their view, exacerbate and make it harder for more middle income people to stay. So, I think it's a complicated question. I don't know if the zoning will actually keep middle and lower cost housing, if it would have any difference. But I can say, I think that we've been exploring some zoning changes. We did through the affordable housing overlay, which I think was just more geared towards building 100% affordable housing. But again, that does leave out other, income brackets.
There's a follow-up question to that. Have other cities tried this?
So Minnesota, they did. I think they've gotten rid of single family zoning. So they eliminated single family zoning. I think a few other cities, but again, this has been really recent, so it hasn't. We can't really learn from that impact just yet.
Can we, I'm sorry to interrupt, but can we acknowledge that Councilwoman Denise Simmons is here?
Yes,
Born and bred Cantabrigian, and can speak about the various vicissitudes of Cambridge politics and social and economic life here. I'm so glad to see your face. I don't feel like a fly in a bowl of milk anymore.
I'm glad you mentioned, because I was going to call Denise to see if she wanted to say a few things, because I know she has a lot to say about these issues.
She's the expert.
Denise, would you? Yeah. You're muted, Denise.
very briefly, I'm having a break at another meeting. Right now I'm chairing a meeting called Monuments, Markers, and Memorials. And what we're doing is we're looking at monuments, markers, and memorials across the city to develop a criteria that looks at, are there any monuments, markers, or memorials that represent people who committed shameful acts, participated in the slave trade, excluded marginalized communities. And so that's what you hear in a little bit, they're getting ready to ramp up. But I wanted to, I think so much of the speakers, first of all, particularly Reverend Monroe, my Mayor Siddiqui, and of course the CCAC board, I want to steal away, so please don't let anyone know that I did it. But the other thing I just wanted to mention very quickly, I thought it was very important, the report that you did, Ms. Pradhan, through the Cambridge Foundation, but it just says, this is sort of let me go back. It reminds me of where we were. It has me looking at where we are, but it tells me how much further we need to go. You know, when we think about Cambridge, I always say the secret of Cambridge, the dirty little secret of Cambridge, where we don't talk about the inequities. We don't talk about the fact that Washington Elms was built primarily for the Black community. We don't talk about the fact that Putnam Gardens was used to house primarily Black families. In Roosevelt Towers, where Mayor Siddiqui grew up many years later, there was a time you didn't go into East Cambridge. It was a death sentence. I recall being told by some young people when I worked for the Civic Unity Committee many years ago. We was doing a study and I said, well, do you ever go to Central Square? And the young woman said to me with all seriousness, well, I don't go to Central Square because there's Black people there and they'll take your jewelry. And I said, oh, okay. We don't talk about the Haitian man that lived in East Cambridge who got beat up on the street. We don't talk about the principal that Bobby D'Alessandro, during her time, brought to Cambridge to head the Agassiz School. She may have headed it before we changed the name. And people were so upset with her, they found a replica of a cross and burnt it on her lawn. So what the report just brought to mind is that how do we come together and really make this the city that we truly need it to be? And so I leave you with that idea and I thank Cambridge Center for Adult Education for offering the opportunity to have these discussions. But then what are we going to do? I'm going to have to sneak back to my group. I'm going to hang on a little bit longer. I hope that this is being taped. Again, CCAC, thank you so much for doing this. There's so much to do in Cambridge. It's hard to just be one place. So again, thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Denise. That was a very powerful reminder of all the wrongs that have been done, all the things that have to be changed, all the things that that need to be changed. And I want to actually thank you for really encouraging us to do a section on the state of Black Cambridge. And I want to thank Ken Reeves because he provided a lot of the historical context, which showed that in the late 1800s, there were both a very strong middle class and a lot of strong Black leaders in the city, and that we had strong homeownership up until the 70s when people thought that they were doing a very smart thing by selling their house for $75,000 and sold their homes and left, and now those same houses are for over $1 million. I think it reminds us that there were good times at one point. The city changed. That's the nature of cities. Cities do change. And I do believe that we have the opportunity to create change again. And with that, I want to thank our fabulous panelists. And I want to say a huge thank you to CCAE for bringing us all together to have this conversation. And to say that we need to continue these conversations and we do need to continue to create change. And We are there. We are your partners in that change and look forward to working with all of you. Mary Catherine, Sarah, I'm going to hand it over to you to close out. Or
Great.
Linda,
Well, we thank everyone as well. Fabulous job, panelists. And let's keep the conversation going. So thank you all for joining us tonight, and look forward to our next season of Conversations on the Edge starting next fall. Thank you.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Take care.